Hi, it's Dr. Marks, and we're going to continue talking about trade today, but specifically I want us to do some practicing by looking at a review problem. Now remember, we've been talking about the theory of comparative advantage, so my objective here is for us to practice doing the same kind of calculations we've been doing, but you should follow along as we go. It's very important that you can ensure your ability to work through a problem just like this. Okay, let's begin. So our objectives. At this point, as I said, we know how to apply the theory of comparative advantage. Once we determine who has the comparative advantage in what, then we know who should specialize in what. And we can also compare the sides of the economic pies. So remember, we can do this before and after specialization. And now we know how to prove that we're better off. We used opportunity cost calculations to make the conclusions above. So really that's what we need to practice today, making sure we can get those calculations correct, making sure that we can decide who should specialize in what, making sure we know how to interpret the numbers that we have. Now, in this lesson, we're going to do another practice problem, and I think this is really going to help you out. It's important that you follow along. But there will be a little new information along the way. So even if you're feeling very comfortable with trade stuff in general, it's important that you watch this lecture and add a little bit to your notes. The goal here, as I said, is to make sure that you can complete this problem. That means you need to have your calculator and your pencils ready, of course your notebook, and you should be working. As we go through the problem, I'm going to pause, and that will allow you to complete the work. Then, of course, we'll check your answers and make sure you're on the right track. But again, as stated, we're going to add a little new information as we go. So don't abort mission and stop watching. So back to our scenario. We've got Guatemala and Honduras, and they can produce shirts or corn, and this is their productivity in one day. So we see that Guatemala can produce 30 shirts in a day, or they can produce 20 units of corn, and Honduras can produce 20 shirts in a day or 40 units of corn. Now again, this is probably more like 20 million pounds or 20-something thousand units. Don't worry about that. We're just keeping the math simple. Again, remember that it's one or the other. So Guatemala would have to choose if it's going to put all its eggs in one basket. Do they produce 30 shirts or 20 corn? Of course, they can produce a combination of the two. That's also an option. First thing I'm likely to ask you, does any country have an absolute advantage in shirts? Well, take a look. What about an absolute advantage in corn? So take a second and make sure that you can answer this question. Hopefully you got the right answer. Probably at this point, this is very easy for you. So who has an absolute advantage in shirts? It's Guatemala. They can produce 30, whereas Honduras can only produce 20. Does anyone have an absolute advantage in corn? Well, here, that's Honduras. They can produce 40, whereas Guatemala can only produce 20. Now we want to determine who should specialize in what. Remember, this means calculating the opportunity cost of shirts and opportunity cost of corn. Now, I know you might be thinking, but wait a minute, if one has the absolute advantage in one and one in the other, then we already know how to divide up the tasks. And you know what? You're exactly right. But this is the approach you're going to need to take on quizzes and tests, because I'm going to be adding on other parts of the problem set, and you'll need opportunity costs. So we're just going to continue along this way. Let's remind ourselves, what is the equation that we need to use to calculate opportunity cost? Let's look at the opportunity cost of shirts. And what's the equation we need to use to calculate the opportunity cost? Rather, I apologize, that should say of corn. My bad. What's the equation we should use to calculate the opportunity cost of corn? So take a moment and see if you can write them out correctly. Just a hint, remember, F over G, foregone over gained. Don't forget that part. So take a second, write out these equations. All right, did you get them right? So opportunity cost of shirts is going to be corn foregone over shirts gained, whereas opportunity cost of corn is going to be shirts foregone over corn gained. So again, and I've said this a million times, and I know I sound like a broken record, but you've got to get these right. It's foregone over gained. If you accidentally do gained over foregone, everything is going to be wrong. Remember, your opportunity costs would be wrong. They'd be the inverse, right? And then you'd have countries specializing in the wrong thing, which means your trade opportunities are going to be backwards. It's just going to wreak havoc. So I can't state this enough. You've got to get these calculations correct. So let's start by calculating opportunity cost of shirts for both countries. Okay, so here's your chart again. What I want you to do is take a moment and do these calculations on your own, and then we'll make sure you got them right. Now, if I start talking before you're ready, just pause the video. All right, let's see how you did. If you're not ready, just hit pause on your video. So for Guatemala, the opportunity cost of shirts is going to be 20 corn foregone over 30 shirts gained. Now, if you're having any trouble at all figuring out where these numbers are coming from, again, the 20 is coming from right there, and then the 30 is coming from right there. So this is the choice that they have to make. Should they produce 20 corn or 30 shirts? If they want to produce the 30 shirts, they've got to give up 20 corn. But remember, we need to reduce this fraction so it has a 1 on the bottom. That's going to make it easier to compare, because ultimately we're going to have to compare between Guatemala and Honduras. So our opportunity cost of shirts for Guatemala, 0.67 corn foregone to gain 1 shirt. All right, now let's look at Honduras. So the opportunity cost of shirts for Honduras, 40 corn foregone divided by 20 shirts gained. Now, if you're having any trouble with this at all, let me just very quickly show you where these came from. So, where did I get 40 corn foregone? Well, that's one of their choices in Honduras. And then the 20, squeaky pen, sorry, comes from right there. Okay. All right, but by now you probably have this down. Again, we have to reduce the fraction, so the opportunity cost of shirts is 2 corn foregone divided by 1 shirt gained. Now, see why we want 1 on the bottom. Now I can compare between Guatemala and Honduras, and ultimately that's what's going to help us decide who should specialize in what. Now, how do we interpret these numbers and what do they mean? So take a moment and look at the opportunity cost numbers for Guatemala and Honduras and make sure that you can interpret them. Put it into a sentence. I always tell students that if you're having trouble with the numbers, convert it to a sentence. So I want you to take a moment and make sure you know a sentence that explains the opportunity cost for Guatemala and do the same for Honduras. All right, well, if you need more time, hit pause on your video. I'm going to go ahead and move on. So, for Guatemala on the left, for every shirt gained, Guatemala must give up 0.67 corn. For Honduras on the right, for every shirt gained in Honduras, Honduras must give up 2 corn. Well, hopefully you can see that one country is going to give up a whole lot more than the other to produce some shirts. Clearly, that's going to tell us who has the comparative advantage. So based on this information, which country has the comparative advantage in shirts? And how do we know? So take a moment, determine who has the comparative advantage in production of shirts. All right, if you need another moment, go ahead and hit pause on your video. So based on this information, hopefully you determined that Guatemala has the comparative advantage in shirts. How do we know this? Because they have the lower opportunity cost. Their opportunity cost, in fact, is far lower than Honduras. Again, Guatemala only gives up 0.67 corn to produce a shirt. Honduras would give up 2 corn to produce that same shirt. So we have to ask, do we want to give up more corn or do we want to give up less corn? Well, clearly we want to give up less corn. Now let's look at the opportunity cost of corn. And of course, this is going to be shirts foregone over corn gained. So now you have the data in front of you, and I want you to do the same thing. I want you to calculate opportunity cost of corn for Guatemala on the left and for Honduras on the right. So take a moment and do those calculations. Let's see how you did. So for Guatemala, opportunity cost of corn is 30 shirts foregone over 20 corn gained. And hopefully by now you see where I'm pulling that information from the table. But again, we have to reduce it to be over 1. So when I reduce the fraction, I get that the opportunity cost of corn for Guatemala is 1.5 shirts divided by 1 corn. For Honduras, they give up 20 shirts in order to gain 40 corn. So when we reduce the fraction, that gives us 0.5 shirts foregone for 1 corn gained. So check your math, make sure you're getting the right answer. Now again, let's interpret these numbers. What do these numbers mean? You need to be able to put it into a sentence form, and that will help make sure that you really understand what these numbers are telling us. So take a moment and take the opportunity cost and structure it as a sentence. Explain to me what that opportunity cost calculation is telling us. So take a moment. We'll continue just in a second. All right, if you need more time, pause the video. I'm going to continue. So on the left for Guatemala, for every corn gained in Guatemala, Guatemala must give up 1.5 shirts. So they give up 1.5 shirts for every corn that they decide to produce. On the right, for every corn gained in Honduras, Honduras must give up half of a shirt. So Guatemala gives up 1.5 shirts, Honduras only gives up half a shirt. Clearly we see very different opportunity costs, and again, that's the point. That's going to help tell us who has the comparative advantage. Based on this information, which country has the comparative advantage in corn? And how do you know? So take a moment and figure out who has the comparative advantage. Do you agree? Honduras has the comparative advantage in corn. How do we know this? Well, their opportunity cost is lower than in Guatemala. In Guatemala, they give up 1.5 shirts to produce a corn. In Honduras, they only give up half a shirt to produce corn. Again, remember, the lower opportunity cost is better. We want to give up less shirts when we produce corn. Based on what you've just calculated, who should specialize in what? Well, we already know who has the comparative advantage in what activity, so now this is just a formality. We've determined Guatemala has the comparative advantage in shirts. They have the comparative advantage because they give up less corn to produce the shirts. And we said that Honduras has the comparative advantage in corn. Again, how do we know that they have the comparative advantage in corn? They gave up fewer shirts to produce the corn. So now we know if we want to divide tasks and have the country specialize, this is the best way to do it. This is going to maximize the economic pie. Now, this answer right here is not surprising because remember, Guatemala had an absolute advantage in shirts to begin with. At the very beginning of this problem, we said, hey, Guatemala has the absolute advantage. And Honduras had the absolute advantage in corn to begin with. So it was very obvious how we should end up dividing these tasks. But again, you'll have problems on your quizzes and tests, and you're not going to be able to just rely on absolute advantage. For example, what if Guatemala had had the absolute advantage in both activities? Then you couldn't use absolute advantage to divide out the tasks. So please remember that you've got to use the theory of comparative advantage, and that means calculating the opportunity costs. All right, so we've assigned Guatemala the task of specializing in shirts, and we've assigned Honduras the task of specializing in corn. Now, a couple questions before we move on. Is it possible for a country to have the absolute advantage in both activities? Is it possible for a country to have the absolute advantage in both activities? Take a second and come up with an answer. Well, the answer is clearly yes. A country can have the absolute advantage in both activities. And we've seen this in some of the examples that we've looked at so far. But this would be akin to the United States versus some developing nation. Likely, we have an absolute advantage in most activities. So when you compare us to a small, poor developing nation, especially a really poor developing nation, yeah, we likely have the absolute advantage in most activities. Anything that we both produce, probably the USA can produce more with the same set of resources. Now, my next question, is it possible for a country to have the comparative advantage in both activities? So take a second and ponder this. Now, admittedly, this is a little bit harder of a question, so let's go through this together. Now, if a country had the comparative advantage in both activities, then this would mean, in our simple two-country examples, that one country would not have a comparative advantage in anything. So in this example, if, let's say, Guatemala had the comparative advantage in both activities, then Honduras would not have the comparative advantage in anything. But remember what the theory says. The theory says that your comparative advantage is the thing for which your disadvantage is the greatest, right? If you're the underdog, then your comparative advantage is the thing for which your disadvantage is the greatest. Well, doesn't everyone have something that they're least bad at? Right? I might be bad at absolutely everything, but there's going to be one task that I'm least bad at, and that would be my comparative advantage. So hopefully you're starting to understand that, yeah, every country has a comparative advantage. So we can't have Guatemala having the comparative advantage in both activities, leaving Honduras with no comparative advantage. That just kind of violates the definition. But we can also answer this mathematically, and I think that will help you tremendously. So let's move on to look at this using some numbers. So first thing I want to point out to you, back to this slide, I've got Guatemala's opportunity cost for corn and opportunity cost for shirts. And I want you to take a look at these numbers. Look at my calculations. For corn, I've got 30 shirts over 20 corn. But when I drop down and do opportunity cost of shirts, I've got 20 corn over 30 shirts. So what do you notice about these two calculations? How are they related? Well, we see that they're inverses of each other. So remember that when you're calculating these, that is one nice way to check your work. But we need to remember these are inverses of each other, because in a minute I'm going to be able to show you something really cool that will answer the question we've just asked. Can a country have the comparative advantage in both activities? Now, look at the same thing for Honduras. For opportunity cost of corn, we've got 20 shirts over 40 corn, but drop down to opportunity cost of shirts and we've got 40 corn over 20 shirts. Again, what do you notice about these calculations? How are they related? Well, they're also inverses of each other. So what that tells us is that the two opportunity costs for a country are going to be inverses of each other. Make sure you understand what I mean by inverse. Inverse means we're just flipping it. We're taking the reciprocal. So the opportunity cost of corn and the opportunity cost of shirts here, as we said, are just inverses of each other. Well, let's look mathematically. What happens when you compare two numbers and then you compare their inverses? And we'll look at a numerical illustration. So let's say we're looking at two numbers, 4 and 2, and we all agree that 4 is greater than 2. But what happens when we look at the inverses? Well, what's the inverse of 4? It's 1/4. And what's the inverse of 2? It's 1/2. So now it becomes, when I look at the inverse, 1/4 and 1/2. But what I really want you to do is look at the greater than or less than sign. What has happened? Where 4 is greater than 2, 1/4 is less than 1/2. What's my point here? Well, what I'm trying to show you is that the bigger number becomes the smaller number when we take the inverse. All right. I know you can understand that, but you're probably thinking, okay, still have no clue where you're going with this, Dr. Marks. Give me one more second. All right, so at this point, I just want you to appreciate opportunity costs are inverses of each other. When we take the inverse, the bigger number becomes the smaller number. The smaller number becomes the bigger number. All right, let's now apply this to our opportunity cost calculations. So back to our opportunity costs. On the left, I've got Guatemala, and on the right, I've got Honduras. Now, look at just the left side. We've got opportunity cost of corn and opportunity cost of shirts. And as you see with my big blue arrow and my big pink note, these are inverses of each other. And on the right, opportunity cost of corn for Honduras and opportunity cost of shirts for Honduras, these are also inverses of each other. All right, give me one more moment and I will drive this point home. Now, remember, when we're looking at comparative advantage, we have to compare between the two. So we compared opportunity cost of corn for Guatemala to the opportunity cost of corn for Honduras. And we noticed that 1.5 is the opportunity cost for Guatemala, 0.5 is the opportunity cost for Honduras. 1.5 is bigger than 0.5, and you see that with my yellow note. All right, so we use theory of comparative advantage, and we see that one has a bigger opportunity cost than the other. One has a smaller opportunity cost than the other. All right, now we're going to look at opportunity cost of shirts. Remember, this is the inverse, so you should already be putting this together. What's going to happen? The bigger number becomes the smaller number. The smaller number becomes the bigger number. Let's see. All right, so now we're looking at opportunity cost of shirts. 0.67 on the left for Guatemala, 2 on the right for Honduras. All right, the number that was bigger, when we take the inverse, becomes the smaller number. All right, so what can we conclude? Is it mathematically possible for Guatemala to have the comparative advantage in both activities? That means they'd have the lower opportunity cost. Could they have the lower opportunity cost for shirts? They do. When I take the inverse, will it still be the smaller number? No, it's going to be the bigger number. So this tells us if Guatemala has the lower opportunity cost in one thing, it's got to have the higher opportunity cost in the other thing. Now, this can be a very handy thing to remember. So when you're doing your math, let's say I first calculate opportunity cost of corn. So go look at those numbers at the top. Opportunity cost of corn, and you're comparing them. 1.5 for Guatemala, 0.5 for Honduras. Okay, Honduras is smaller. We know Honduras has the comparative advantage. Immediately, what do you know? If Honduras has the comparative advantage in corn, can they also have the comparative advantage in shirts? No. We automatically know Guatemala is going to have the lower opportunity cost in shirts. So technically, you really only need to calculate one set of opportunity cost numbers, unless you're going to need them for something else, and we will for other parts of the problem. But this is another way for you to check your work. So mathematically, is it possible to have the smaller number and then take the inverse and still have the smaller number? It's not, right? So again, what that means is when you have the opportunity cost that's lower in one thing, then you're automatically going to have the higher opportunity cost in the other thing. You can't possibly have the lower opportunity cost in both. Therefore, you can't have therefore you can't have the comparative advantage in both activities. All right, I think I've beat that horse to death, but this is an important point, and it will help you check your work. And of course, I'm going to ask you questions about this on quizzes and tests. All right, moving on. Now let's look at our economic pies. Remember, our economic pie simply captures what have we produced? What's the productivity look like? So we've determined who should specialize in what, right? We said that Guatemala should specialize in shirts and Honduras should specialize in corn. That's why I have those circled. And now we want to see what's in the economic pies. So first, let's do this for specialization. And then, of course, we're going to do it when we're not specializing. Okay? So first specialization, and then we're going to compare it to the case where we're not specializing. As before, remember, when countries are not specializing, we're going to assume that they spend half of their time on each activity. I'm just doing that to make the math a little easier. It doesn't really force it to work out or anything like that. All right, let's continue. So, on the left, when countries specialize, what's in the economic pie? And on the right, when countries do not specialize, what's in the economic pie? Remember, when we're not specializing, we're assuming that you spend half of your time making shirts and half of your time producing corn. So take a moment and calculate what's in the economic pies and write it down. All right, so take another moment and finish this question. If you need a little more time, just pause your video. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and move on. So let's check your work. So on the left, when countries specialize, what's in the economic pie? Well, Guatemala, we know, is going to produce 30 shirts. That's easy, right? It's already circled for you. Remember, when you're specializing, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. So Guatemala is going to put all its resources into the production of shirts, and in a day they can produce 30 shirts. And Honduras, we see that also circled. They're going to be specializing in corn. If they put all their resources into corn, they can produce 40 corn. So we're going to end up in the economic pie that represents specialization. We're going to end up with 30 shirts and 40 corn. Now let's compare to the situation where the countries do not specialize. Now remember, we're making the assumption that you're going to spend half of your time producing shirts and half of your time making corn. Now, I could do it different ways, 1/3, 2/3. There's a whole range of combinations that would work. I'm just making the math easier. So let's take a look. Guatemala, if they spend half of their time producing shirts, they can produce 15. How did I get that? Well, let's come up here and take a look. They can produce 30 in one day. So if they spend half their day, they can produce 15. Now, they can also, in Guatemala, produce 10 corn in half a day. Again, how did I get that? Because they can do 20 in one day. Spending half a day gives us 10. So 15 shirts and 10 corn for Guatemala. Honduras can produce 10 shirts and 20 corn. Again, where did I get that? Well, in one day, Honduras can produce 20 shirts. Spending half a day, they can do 10. In one day, they can produce 40 corn, but in half a day, they can produce 20. All right? So again, that's really easy. Don't make that any harder than it is. When I add these together, I get 25 shirts and 30 corn. So make sure you're getting the right answers. Okay? So there we go. On the left, when we're specializing, we have 30 shirts and 40 corn. On the right, when we're not specializing, we have 25 shirts and 30 corn. Now, in the box below, in the peach color, it asks, when we compare the two economic pies, what do we learn? In other words, what's gained, what's foregone? Now, I want to remind you, we want to go from not specializing to specializing, right? Before and after. So, on a test, I may change it up in terms of which question I ask you first. It's your job to remember we want to go from not specializing to specializing, all right? So, before specialization, 25 shirts plus 30 corn. After specialization, 30 shirts and 40 corn. Make sure you're looking in the right direction. So, first let's look at shirts. Before specialization, we produced 25 shirts in the economic pie when we look at the combined productivity. But under specialization, when we divided the tasks based on comparative advantage, well, now we're producing 30 shirts. So we see that shirts have increased by 5. Now let's take a look at corn. When we look at corn, we had 30 corn when we weren't specializing, and under specialization, again, when we divide the tasks based on comparative advantage, we end up with 40 corn. So do you agree that corn has increased by 10? So what we see is that shirts has increased by 5 and corn has increased by 10. Okay, so now I've got my economic pies next to each other. Again, when we're specializing, that's on the left. When we're not specializing, we're on the right. So do you agree the economic pie is bigger under specialization? It should be obvious. We have more shirts and we have more corn. So we didn't trade off anything. Through specialization, we got more shirts and more corn. So clearly, the economic pie is bigger. So finally, let's summarize. It's important that you be able to follow this example. This is a pretty simple example. You see the math is easy. And do you notice I'm just using the same process over and over and over? So you really just need to get comfortable with the process. You're going to see it repeated over and over and over again. So you first need to be able to determine absolute advantage. Remember, absolute advantage just simply says you can produce more. With the same resources, you're able to produce more. So both countries have one day, and one can produce more than the other. You need to then be able to calculate opportunity costs. Remember the thing you have to be aware of, foregone over gained. Please don't get that backwards or upside down. You then need to be able to determine who has the comparative advantage. That's going to be the country that has the lower opportunity costs, the country that gives up the least. Then you have to be able to calculate the economic pies. Remember, the economic pies simply count how many shirts, how many corn. It's just a way of capturing total output. In future problems, we're going to add on to this problem. So you've got to be able to get these completely correct, because now that we have the economic pies, we'd move on to talking about creating a trade agreement. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know if you have any questions.